My name is Emma, and I'm 28 years old. I live in a small town called Willow Creek. If you've ever visited, you'd remember the charm of its cobblestone streets, the bakery on Main Street, and the smell of rain that lingers in the air after a storm. It's a quiet place, the kind where everyone knows everyone. I teach at the local primary school, and my students are the best part of my day. There's Mia, who's shy but has the sweetest smile, and Jason, who always asks a million questions. Kids have a way of reminding you about the beauty in simple things, like a sunny day or a favorite storybook. My life. It's peaceful. Maybe too peaceful. Most days, I wake up to the smell of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs. My best friend Sophie owns it, and we share the same building. Me in the apartment above, and her running the shop below. We have tea on the balcony every Sunday, where we talk about everything. Work, dreams, and of course, our non-existent love lives. I'll be honest. My love life hasn't exactly been a fairy tale. My last boyfriend, Eric, left me because he wasn't ready for commitment. I tried not to take it personally, but it left a mark. Since then, I've been cautious, maybe even a little afraid to let anyone in. But deep down, I still dream of a love that feels right. It was a Friday evening, and the rain was falling softly outside. I had just finished work and decided to stop by the local bookstore. It's my little sanctuary, a place where I can lose myself in stories that feel like they understand me. As I stood in the fiction aisle, flipping through a book, someone spoke. "Excuse me, do you know if this author's other books are as good as this one?" I looked up and saw him. A man, tall with dark hair and an easy smile, holding a book by one of my favorite authors. "I think they're great," I replied, smiling back. "But maybe I'm biased. I've read all of them." That's how I met Daniel. We started talking about books, then about the town. He told me he had just moved to Willow Creek for a new job as a graphic designer. There was something effortless about our conversation, like we'd known each other for years instead of minutes. As I walked home that night, the rain falling softly around me, I couldn't stop smiling. I texted Sophie as soon as I got back. "Met someone interesting today. His name is Daniel. He seems different." Sophie replied almost immediately. "Different, how? Spill the details." I stared at the screen, trying to find the words. I didn't know how to explain it, but there was something about Daniel that made me feel hopeful in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Daniel and I started seeing each other more often after that rainy evening in the bookstore. At first, it was small things, a coffee after work, a walk in the park. He had this way of making me feel seen, like I wasn't just another face in the crowd. I learned so much about him during those early days. He was charming, funny, and thoughtful. He told me he had moved to Willow Creek for a fresh start, leaving behind the chaos of city life. He said he wanted to slow down, to focus on the things that really mattered. We were weeks into our budding relationship when he invited me to his place. I remember feeling nervous but excited. His apartment was modern and minimalistic, with a few quirky art pieces that hinted at his creativity. It was on one of these evenings, as we sat on his couch sharing a bottle of wine, that something unexpected happened. His phone buzzed, and he turned it over quickly, muttering something about work. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I wonder, was that the first crack in the illusion? As the weeks passed, I started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. Daniel was always kind and attentive, but there were moments when he seemed distant, almost as if his mind was somewhere else. He'd cancel plans last minute with vague excuses or disappear for hours without explanation. At first, I told myself not to overthink it. Everyone's busy, I thought. But then there were other signs, like how he avoided introducing me to his friends or how he never talked about his past in detail. One evening, Sophie noticed my mood and asked me what was wrong. "I don't know," I admitted, swirling my tea. "Daniel's great, but sometimes it feels like he's holding something back." Sophie tilted her head, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Have you asked him about it?" "No," I said quickly, almost defensively. I don't want to seem paranoid. But deep down, I was starting to feel uneasy. It's a strange thing, that nagging voice in the back of your mind. You try to ignore it, to push it aside, but it grows louder the more you suppress it. It wasn't until a month later that the voice became impossible to ignore. We were having dinner at a small Italian restaurant one evening when his phone buzzed again. This time, he didn't turn it over. Instead, he glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted. Just for a second, but enough for me to notice. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah," he said quickly, slipping the phone into his pocket. "Just work stuff." But the way he avoided my gaze told me otherwise. The next day, Sophie and I were sitting in her bakery when I finally confided in her. "Sophie, do you think Daniel might be hiding something?" Her eyebrows shot up. "Hiding what?" "I don't know," I said, feeling silly. He acts weird sometimes. Like he's distracted or he's keeping secrets." Sophie finished for me. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. Saying it out loud made it feel real. Sophie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Emma, you deserve someone who's honest with you. Maybe it's time to ask him directly." That night, I decided to talk to Daniel. I rehearsed what I would say, pacing my apartment and trying to keep my emotions in check. But when I called him, he didn't answer. And when I texted, the reply came hours later. "Sorry, busy day. Can we talk tomorrow?" I wanted to believe him, but the sinking feeling in my chest told me otherwise. The next day, I went to his apartment unannounced. I told myself it was because I wanted to surprise him, but the truth was, I needed answers. When I arrived, he wasn't home. But as I turned to leave, I noticed a piece of mail sticking out of his mailbox. It was addressed to Daniel and Emily Parker. Emily. My mind raced as I stared at the name. Who was Emily? A roommate? A sister? Or someone else? That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed every moment with Daniel, searching for clues I might have missed. The phone calls, the cancelled plans, the way he avoided certain topics, it all started to make sense. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the doubt was eating me alive. The next time I saw him, I decided to confront him. We were sitting in his living room when I blurted it out. "Daniel, who's Emily?" His face went pale. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She's my wife. You're married," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Daniel nodded, his face a mixture of guilt and resignation. "Why didn't you tell me?" My voice cracked. "How could you? Why would you?" "I didn't plan this," he said quickly. "I swear, Emma, I didn't mean for things to go this far." "Go this far," I repeated, my anger rising. "You lied to me, Daniel. Every single moment we spent together. You made me believe it was real. Was any of it real?" "It is real," he said, reaching for my hand. I pulled away. "You don't get to say that," I snapped, standing up. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might break free from my chest. He tried to explain, but his words felt hollow. He and Emily had been separated for months, he said. They were living separate lives. But the divorce wasn't final. "I didn't know how to tell you," he admitted. "I was afraid you'd walk away." "And now?" I asked, my voice cold. "What do you expect me to do now?" He didn't have an answer. That night, I went home and cried harder than I had in years. The tears came in waves, mingled with anger, betrayal, and sadness. I wanted to hate Daniel, but part of me still loved him, and that made everything worse. Sophie came over as soon as I told her. She sat beside me on the couch, holding my hand as I poured my heart out. "Emma, this isn't your fault," she said firmly. "You trusted him. He's the one who broke that trust." "I feel so stupid," I muttered, wiping my tears. How could I not see it? All those little signs. They were there, Sophie. I just ignored them because I wanted to believe in him. "You're not stupid," Sophie said. "You're human. You gave him your heart because you thought he deserved it. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I tried to focus on work, on my students, but my mind kept drifting back to Daniel. Every time I thought about him, I felt a mix of longing and anger. Had I been so desperate for love that I ignored my instincts? Or was I just unlucky, falling for someone who wasn't who he claimed to be? One night, I sat on my bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I didn't recognize the person looking back at me. Tired, broken, and unsure of herself. "Maybe I'm not enough," I whispered to no one. Those words haunted me. They seeped into my thoughts, making me question everything about myself. Was I too naive? Too trusting? Was I destined to always be the girl who fell for the wrong guy? Things came to a head one afternoon when I ran into Daniel at the bookstore. I hadn't seen or spoken to him since that night, and the sight of him brought back all the feelings I'd been trying to bury. "Emma, wait," he said as I turned to leave. I hesitated, my heart warring with my head. Finally, I turned around. "What do you want, Daniel?" I asked, my voice weary. "I need to explain," he said. "I know I hurt you, but please, just hear me out." Against my better judgment, I let him talk. He told me more about his marriage, how it had been falling apart for years, how he and Emily had grown distant and unhappy. He insisted that what we had wasn't a lie, that he truly cared about me. "You deserve better," he said, his voice breaking. "I know that. But I didn't want to lose you." His words struck a chord, but they didn't erase the pain he'd caused. "That's not love, Daniel," I said quietly. "Love is honest. Love doesn't come with secrets and half-truths." For the first time, I saw tears in his eyes. But instead of feeling vindicated, I felt empty. A week later, Sophie and I were at the bakery when Emily walked in. My heart stopped. I recognized her from a photo I'd seen in Daniel's apartment. A picture he'd claimed was an old friend. She was beautiful, poised, and had a presence that made the room feel smaller. She didn't seem to notice me, but seeing her in person forced me to confront a painful reality. I had been a part of someone else's story, a story I had no right to be in. That evening, as I sat alone on my balcony, the weight of everything came crashing down. I thought about my parents' divorce, about the promises they'd broken, and how I'd vowed never to repeat their mistakes. And yet, here I was, caught in a web of lies and broken trust. I realized I couldn't keep living in limbo, torn between my feelings for Daniel and the truth of what he'd done. I had to make a choice, one that would either set me free or leave me with more questions than answers. The next morning, I wrote Daniel a letter. I told him how much he had hurt me, but also how much I had learned about myself through the pain. I ended with this: "I deserve a love that's whole and honest. And so do you. Until you find that, I can't be a part of your life." As I sealed the envelope, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't closure, but it was a step toward reclaiming my story. Would this be the end? Or just the beginning of something new? Only time would tell. The weeks after I sent the letter were some of the loneliest I'd ever experienced. I avoided the bookstore, the park, and anywhere else that might remind me of Daniel. My usual joy in teaching was replaced with a numb routine. Even Sophie's attempts to cheer me up fell flat. One Friday night, I found myself sitting on the kitchen floor, staring at an untouched dinner I'd made for no one. The silence in my apartment was deafening. I picked up my phone, scrolling aimlessly through old photos. There was one of Daniel and me at the park, laughing at something silly. I'd taken it without him noticing, and now, looking at it felt like reopening a wound. Tears streamed down my face as the weight of everything crashed over me. How had I let myself get here? How had I allowed someone else's lies to shatter me like this? "I don't know who I am anymore," I whispered to the empty room. It was in that moment, curled up on the cold floor, that I realized just how far I'd fallen. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and swollen eyes. As I stared at the ceiling, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, stuck in a cycle of pain and self-doubt. But what could I do? Part of me wanted to confront Daniel one last time, to demand answers and closure. Another part of me wanted to run away, to leave Willow Creek and all its memories behind. I sat at my desk, staring at a blank piece of paper. My thoughts swirled as I wrestled with what to do. And then, a thought came to me, a memory really. When I was a child, my mother used to tell me, "Emma, when you feel lost, go back to the things that make you feel whole. Start small. The rest will follow." What made me feel whole? Writing, teaching, connecting with people who mattered. I realized then that this wasn't just about Daniel. This was about me reclaiming the parts of myself I had let slip away. That afternoon, I took a walk by the river. It was the same spot where Daniel and I had gone on one of our first dates. The memory stung, but as I stood there, I forced myself to look deeper. Yes, Daniel had lied to me, but I had also lied to myself. I had ignored my instincts, allowed my fear of being alone to cloud my judgment, and placed my happiness in someone else's hands. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to truly feel the pain, the anger, and the sadness. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. As I stood there, watching the water flow, I thought about the kind of person I wanted to be. Strong, whole, someone who could love without losing herself. When I got home, I grabbed my journal, a gift Sophie had given me years ago that I'd barely touched, and began to write. At first, the words came slowly, hesitant and clumsy. But soon, they started pouring out. My fears, my dreams, my regrets, and my hopes for the future. Writing felt like breathing again, like I was reconnecting with a part of myself I'd forgotten. That night, I made another decision. I wouldn't confront Daniel or try to get answers from him. He had made his choices, and I had made mine. What I needed now wasn't closure from him. It was closure from within. I called Sophie and told her everything. "I think I'm ready to move forward," I said. Sophie's voice was warm and steady. "I'm proud of you, Emma. You deserve so much more than what he gave you." That evening, as I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. It was fragile and fleeting, but it was there. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. One where I would write my own happiness, one page at a time. The first step I took was putting myself first. I'd spent so long trying to make sense of someone else's choices, trying to piece together the shattered remnants of my relationship with Daniel, that I'd forgotten about my own needs. I enrolled in a yoga class. It seemed simple, almost trivial, but it was a start. I'd always admired people who could find peace within themselves, and I figured yoga might help me do that, even just a little. The first class was awkward. I couldn't keep up with the instructor's pace, and every pose seemed to stretch a little too far. But something about it felt right. The quiet, the focus on breathing, the effort to be present in the moment. It reminded me that healing doesn't come from forcing it. It comes from allowing yourself the time and space to grow. After yoga, I took up painting again. I hadn't touched a brush in years, and the idea of creating something from nothing felt like a form of self-rescue. At first, the canvases were just colors, shapes, nothing meaningful. But with each brushstroke, I felt a little more like myself again. I also started saying no. No to unnecessary commitments, no to toxic people, and most importantly, no to the self-doubt that had kept me in a constant state of uncertainty. It was hard at first. Saying no felt like rejection. But I soon realized it wasn't about rejecting others. It was about accepting myself. As weeks passed, I noticed something shifting inside me. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but the change was real. I started feeling more like the woman I used to be. The one who was full of life, of dreams, of ambition. The woman who didn't apologize for taking up space in the world. I began taking longer walks around Willow Creek. I'd stop by the bakery to chat with Sophie, visit the local bookstore to browse through books I'd forgotten about, or sit by the river and just watch the world go by. I wasn't waiting for a phone call or an apology from Daniel anymore. I was learning to live for me. The sadness still came in waves, but it no longer controlled me. I was no longer trapped in the past. There were moments when I still thought about Daniel, about the love I had believed was real, about the lies he told. But with each passing day, I felt stronger. The love I had for him had not disappeared, but but it had been replaced by something more important: self-love. It wasn't just within myself that I began to see changes. I felt a renewed sense of purpose in my work. My students noticed it, too. I was more patient, more engaged, and most importantly, more present. I found joy in their small victories. Whether it was a student mastering a difficult math concept or a shy kid sharing their thoughts for the first time. I also began reconnecting with old friends. I had withdrawn so much into myself after everything with Daniel that I'd let some friendships slip away. But now I reached out. I went to dinners, planned weekend trips, and made an effort to be part of the world again. Sophie became my anchor during this time. She was always there with a word of encouragement or a funny story to make me laugh. One night, we sat on the couch together, our favorite movie on in the background, and she turned to me. "You're really doing it, aren't you?" she said, her voice full of admiration. "I'm trying," I said with a smile, not quite believing how far I had come. I wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, of wondering if I had made the right choices. But with each day, I felt myself standing a little taller. One evening, about 3 months after I had written the letter to Daniel, I sat in my favorite spot by the river. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue across the water. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. I thought about everything I had been through, about the pain of betrayal, the despair of not knowing who I was anymore, and the long road of healing that had followed. But I also thought about how far I had come. I had learned to trust myself again. I had learned that no matter how much I might love someone else, I couldn't lose myself in the process. I had learned that sometimes, letting go isn't about giving up. It's about making space for something better, for a better version of yourself. And I realized something important. The happiness I had been searching for had never been outside of me. It had always been within me, waiting for me to find it again. The last few months hadn't been easy, but they had been necessary. I was no longer the woman who had clung to a broken relationship in the hope of fixing it. I was the woman who had learned that sometimes, the most important thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from what doesn't serve you, no matter how much it hurts. I took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill my lungs. For the first time in a long while, I felt whole. I wasn't perfect. I didn't have all the answers. But I had something far more important: peace. And that was enough for now. As I sat there by the river, the sun setting in the distance, a thought echoed in my mind. I am finally enough. It wasn't just a fleeting thought or an empty affirmation. It was a truth I had fought for, a truth that had taken me months to truly understand. I had spent so much of my life seeking validation from others, whether it was through relationships, accomplishments, or the approval of those around me. But in that quiet moment, I realized that I didn't need anyone else to tell me I was enough. I had to believe it for myself. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer defined me. It had shaped me, yes, but it hadn't broken me. I was stronger now, not because I had erased the hurt, but because I had learned to carry it with grace, to honor it as part of my story. I had learned that sometimes, the hardest part of healing is accepting that you are worthy of peace, of love, and of happiness. That you are deserving of a future that is not weighed down by the mistakes of the past. But as much as I had grown, I knew that the journey wasn't over. I still had more to learn, more to experience, and more to become. The road ahead was unknown, but for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of what it might bring. Maybe I would meet someone new. Maybe I would face more challenges. Or maybe, just maybe, I would continue to rediscover parts of myself I hadn't even realized I'd lost. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for sure. I was ready. And so, I let the river carry my thoughts away, knowing that I didn't have to have everything figured out right now. Life wasn't about perfect resolutions. It was about embracing the journey and trusting that, in the end, we are always enough. Maybe, like me, you've faced moments of heartbreak and doubt. Maybe you've wondered if you'll ever find your way back to yourself. But I want you to remember this. Sometimes, letting go is the first step to finding who you're meant to be. And just like me, you will find your way.